Hello everyone, welcome back to the Quick Carbon Podcast, now episode 23. Standard reminder, of course, that this is a podcast, meaning it's primarily audio, instead of a single visual backdrop for the entire time. However, it will consistently shift between pieces of my own photography, and if anyone really wants to see it in a much better presentation, along with some meaningful music and stuff matched up to it, then I have a few year-by-year photography slideshow or showcase videos that I'll start putting links to. But regardless, as usual, if anybody wants to support the podcast and everything else, or just help me out, you can send directly through PayPal or sign up to the monthly thing on Patreon. But we have a number of things rolling out here as this week is ending, starting with the primary title item in interior Iraq, in the Kurdistan region. A likely massive new oil discovery was just made. For those unfamiliar, most of the Middle East is already explored and developed in terms of oil and gas, with the primary exception being Iraq, particularly, that is, interior Iraq. And one of the exploration companies doing exploratory wells there made a discovery this week that was rather massive compared to normal discovery standards that we're used to seeing around the world in the present day. With varying levels of porosity in the oil-bearing rock layer, they discovered a oil reservoir with a thickness level in the rock layer of an entire kilometer. Now, it's not uniform all the way through. Like I said, it has different flow rates and porosity levels in, different broken patches of that 1 kilometer of rock. But that's still an entire kilometer of oil-bearing rock layer. As what we're used to seeing nowadays, making much smaller, more modest discoveries. Usually things are like 30 meters thick, 75 meters thick. Saw some that were like 120 meters thick. One notable exception being in my own homeland of Alaska, in a location called Smith Bay. We discovered recently what we're just calling the Smith Bay Field a few years back, which had a thickness level of its oil-bearing rock layer of between 220 and 250 meters, and is expected to contain anywhere between 2 to 6 billion barrels of extractable oil. So this discovery in Kurdish Iraq, given both its size and the nature of that region, the whole Persian Gulf slash, expanded Persian Gulf basin, while they don't actually have estimates out for it yet, because they have to drill a few more wells around it and do some more sounding, try to figure out its exact, three-dimensional size and form. This is likely to be quite massive. With no hesitation, this is definitely probably in the billions of barrels. Within the 1 kilometer oil-bearing layer, like I said, there were different sort of segments with different levels of porosity and different levels of oil saturation. The company in particular identified 3 very well-flowing high-grade layers within that 1 kilometer, one of them being about 150 meters thick, another being about 70 meters thick, and another being about 200 meters thick. This probably has a few billion barrels in there. Now, dealing with other stuff as well, most likely on the immediate list, the drilling rig counts. The international count outside of the US and Canada only updates monthly, so we have the weekly US count, which is still falling, obviously. It was just above 400 actively drilling rigs still last week. This week, it is down to 374, whereas only a couple months ago, it was up around 800 actively drilling rigs. Individual states, the states that actually dropped at least, or changed, because New Mexico actually added a few. Texas continues dropping, now down below 200, all the way down to 173. New Mexico actually recovered a few from 66 up to 70. They used to be up towards 120 before everything started. North Dakota, which again had been holding in the 50s in its rig count for the last several years, trying to desperately keep the Bakken Shale at its production rate. North Dakota still shedding rigs, now all the way down to 20. Oklahoma, which had been at 120 or so drilling rigs before it started dropping, is now all the way down to only 13 left. Louisiana, which had also been up around Oklahoma's rig count, Louisiana is now down to only 38. And the only other state that moved was the last holdout, the one state that had been holding still even through the whole market collapse. Ohio finally dropped. It had been holding 9 rigs steady, and it has now begun losing rigs, dropping down to 8 as of this week. Canada, if you remember from the previous episode, or the episode before that, whichever one it was, over the course of April, Canada's drilling rig count dropped from 133 active rigs down to only 33, so exactly a loss of 100, and as of this week, 1 week later, Canada is now down to only 26. Some updates on global jet fuel consumption. Again, normally in the springtime, in present day at least, global jet fuel consumption would be around or a bit above 6 million barrels per day. Because of all the travel restrictions, at its absolute low point, at its trough, it had gone down to only 1.7 million barrels per day. However, as a bunch of stuff is starting back up, and some degree of travel in some places is starting to be allowed again, particularly in a number of the Eastern Asian nations that basically crushed the virus, like China, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, global jet fuel consumption had climbed back up to 2.1 million barrels per day as of last week. However, now it has continued going back up and is up to 2.3 million barrels per day. In terms of natural gas, since those weekly numbers came out, U.S. natural gas production continues falling from over 104 billion cubic feet per day last week down to 103.4. U.S. natural gas consumption came in at 72.6 billion cubic feet per day. Individual numbers within that being heating demand, 13. Consumption by natural gas-fired power plants, 25.4. U.S. natural gas exports on LNG tankers, 7.7. Consumption by the pipelines for its own pumping system fuel, 6.1. U.S. natural gas storage inventories are now up to 2.32 trillion cubic feet in storage. In comparison to, normally, they would be still down actually at 1.92, and last year at this time, they were still down at 1.52. And natural gas prices had climbed back up to around $2 per thousand cubic feet, but over the course of the week, they dropped back down a bit, down into the mid $1.80 range. As stuff is starting back up, U.S. electricity consumption, or U.S. electricity demand, has been rising back up by a bit at least. At the low point several weeks back, you remember we were down, averaging the peak demand levels between 5 and 8 p.m. or so, being only around 420 gigawatts of active demand, and the trough, the absolute bottom level of demand in the middle of the night, being down as low as around 315. In comparison to normally, under normal circumstances, outside of summer and winter, in the neutral seasons, spring and fall, normally U.S. electricity demand would have a peak during the day of around like 500, 510, and then fall to a low of around like 420, 430 at night. So to give you a comparison for the difference. However, over the last few weeks, it started picking back up with the daily high, the daily peak, now getting back up to around the 440s in terms of gigawatts, and the nightly low only going down to 330 or so instead of 315. The expectations are now out also for the likely total for the expected drop in global oil production, including both the OPEC++ group willing production cuts and the expected lost production from shutdown and lack of drilling activity. But they're expected all to willingly cut a total of around 10 million barrels per day. And the U.S., again, is expected to lose about 3 million barrels a day of production from its shale fields because of the rig count collapse. So that would bring it up to 13. And an additional 4 million barrels a day or so is expected to be lost based on drops in drilling activity in different areas around the world, and who's been having to shut down what fields and whatnot. So 17 million barrels per day lost from global oil production, down from 102. So obviously that would drop it down to about 85 million barrels per day of production. It's still higher than that at the moment. I believe it's like 94 or something, because you can't just instantaneously cut everything off. It does take time to wind things down. And global oil consumption, as we mentioned, is back up to likely between 81 and 82. And by the end of the month is expected to be above 85, somewhere in the upper 80s. So supply and demand are actually going to hit a point where they meet back up. And for a brief time, there is actually going to be an overshoot. However, it's not going to, cause like massive supply crunches, because, the inventories around the world are kind of swollen to the absolute brim at the moment because of the multiple months we've had of production being, over 10 million barrels per day in overshoot of supply, or of demand, I mean. And the International Silver Institute, which gets in-depth, pretty specific silver data in production and consumption across the world, they finally updated with the 2019 data. And in 2019, did global silver production from mines continue falling? Yes, it did. Global silver production from mines peaked in 2015, as we've said many times. It peaked at about 893 million ounces mined that year. In 2016, it fell a tiny bit to 892. In 2017, it dropped down to a bit above 863. In 2018, it fell down to about 848. And last year, it was down to only 836.5 million ounces of silver mined over the year. All right, that's it for this one. So thanks everybody for sticking around and listening. If you want to support everything or just help me, then like I said, PayPal, Patreon down in the description below, along with links to my photography show videos. But that's it from me for now. So God bless you all. I will see you all around next time.